Minasbad sword is one of those fantastic Filipino sword designs that does not necessarily get the same kind of attention than its other Filipino sword brethren like the Kris, the Barong, the Itak Tagalog, or even the Ginunting. The Minasbad sword hails from a region of the Philippines called Bicol that has a very long history in warfare, specifically in Filipino warfare where the Bicolanos fought directly with two very fierce warring tribes, specifically the Cebuanos and the Moros. One thing I want to point out as it relates to Filipino weaponry, which is a little different from the other sword culture that Filipino swordsmanship is often compared to, Japanese swordsmanship, because of the conflict in World War II, is that unlike Japanese swordsmanship, where in mass warfare there were no shields in place, in the Philippines, especially pre-Spanish Philippines, there was a lot of sword and shield play. Specifically, the extremely well-designed shield of the Cebuano Kalasag. Extremely sturdy and has the capability to cover the entire length of the torso of the Cebuano warrior. So if you can imagine, as a Bicolano, when you are picking your sword and you're up against this kind of shield, you have to think very thoroughly about the design and weight distribution of the sword. And what they came up with is the exceptionally robust Minasbad sword. The Minasbad carries the same level of prestige and reputation as the American Bowie in the United States. It is considered deadly, but also double duty. One of the best sources that I have found as it relates to the history of the Minasbad is a YouTube video by Lorenz Lasco. And Lorenz Lasco is a Filipino historian with advanced degrees in local history from Oxford University in the United Kingdom. In this particular YouTube video, he goes through a very specific outline and dissertation of the history of the Minasbad. He delivers his dissertation in Tagalog, in the main language of the Philippines. But luckily for you, Rolando Estacada, nakakapag-Tagalog pa ako, marunong pa rin. One of my important sources happens to be Lorenz Lasco in this particular episode, but also through my own personal research and personal study. So if you understand Tagalog, that's a very good resource for you to go to. When you first take a look at the Minasbad sword, the first thing you think of is, it looks just like a Chinese broadsword, I don't see the difference. And that part I get, because the first time I saw a Minasbad sword, I thought the same thing. But one thing I want us to think about is that from my own experience of handling Chinese broadswords, they didn't necessarily have the weight and heft of the Minasbad. And I believe that this contributes to its relative lack of popularity outside of the Philippines simply because it doesn't have that unique kind of look that most Filipino swords have. If you take a look at the Moro Kris or the Barong or the Ginunting, these are very unique designs. When you take a look at the Minasbad, it's very hard to tell what its unique features are. But upon further investigation and also through the dissertation of Mr. Lorenzo Lasco's episode on YouTube relating to the history and design of the Minasbad, nothing could be further from the truth. This is a very purpose-driven sword with a lot of interesting features that you will see when I move with the Minasbad sword. You will see that it moves very differently from any sword that I have ever handled on this channel. The first thing I want to point out as it relates to the history of the Minasbad sword is the fact that this was a sword that was used in warfare pre-colonial Spanish occupation, meaning that a lot of the fighting that was done with this sword was within sword and shield context. So when you take a look at this example of the Cebuano Kalasag, that's what the Minasbad was up against. It was also up against armored warfare. So the Cebuanos had armor, and so did the Moros. When you take a look at this specific sword, the one thing that you want to think about in terms of not only its design, but also the movement patterns that are going to be correlated to it, this is a very specific sword. This is the kind of sword that was designed and historically correlated with armored battlefield warfare. So this is the first sword that I'm going to be reviewing on this channel that has a history connected to armored battlefield warfare. The reason why this is important is that if we are to take a look at the most commonly associated sword with Filipino warfare, the Itak Tagalog also known as a bolo, also known as a machete, you will see some similarities but some stark differences in terms of its handling. It's very obvious that you can see that there is a belly swell between the two, but if we hold them side by side, what you start to see is that there is a narrowing of the blade itself closer to the handle along the minasbad, whereas that termination of the belly swell is not that sharp compared to the Itak Tagalog. It terminates far more evenly, whereas the minasbad terminates far more sharply. It has more correlations to the type of swords that we see in that region, specifically the Dahon Palay family. The second thing I want to point out is that according to Lorenz Lasco, there are 3 types of minasbad swords, and I'm going to use the Filipino terminology for it. There are 3 types. The first one is what's called pangbukid. Bukid in the Philippines means field. So pangbukid means this is for the field. Meaning you go out there, you do your woodcraft, bushcraft, you have to clear away some vines, so you have to clear away some vegetation. There's a type of minasbad for it. The other one is called pangbahay. Bahay means house. So this is your house minasbad, meaning it's a little more decorative. It has some amazing decorative features to it, especially the antique versions, which reflects a lot of local cultural beliefs and its system of warfare. The third one is what's called pangtao. And tao in Tagalog means person, meaning it is a fighting minasbad and it is for a person. When we think of the minasbad in this manner, as it relates to its correlations, according to Lorenz Lasco, the minasbad has less correlations with the Chinese broadsword and has more correlations with a sword from Borneo called the Belada Belabad. When we start to take all of these data points into consideration, some things start to make sense as it relates to its design and also its handling. Because it is an armored warfare sword, you can expect it to be far more tip heavy, meaning as a slasher and as a chopper, not only is it expected to move very swiftly through slashes and cuts, you have to expect it to cut through hard targets, specifically should it make impact with the Cebuano Kalasag. We don't necessarily see that with the Itak Tagalog because the Itak Tagalog wasn't necessarily designed with armored warfare in mind, at least its modern iterations. So a lot of the modern iterations specific to the Itak Tagalog also had double duty, but it was no longer dealing with armored warfare. It had to be light enough but also short enough so that if it is being carried by Filipino guerrillas in World War II, not only could they carry it with one hand, they could hold a pistol in the other. This is extremely evident in the statue of Andres Bonifacio, which I have featured many times on this channel, where you see him holding his sword on the right hand and the gun on the left hand. So it gives you an idea of the purpose of the Itak Tagalog as it relates to the more modern warfare that the Philippines entered into in the 20th century. But this being a pre-Spanish colonial era sword design, it is far more purpose-driven as it relates to armored warfare. Hence, you see this very sharp termination of the belly swell so that when it falls forward, it really falls forward. But it lends more to the kind of movements that are wider so that there's more torque that is coming from the core. And once I develop that momentum with this sword, you can imagine how it must have moved on the battlefield. Other interesting features specifically to the historic design of the minasbad is the fact that in the more antique versions, the handle material used was the Filipino carabao horn, our water buffalo. What is interesting is the pommel. The pommel design, as you can see, has this face here, and some people say that this has a war face. And in some antique versions, it actually has horns sticking out of it, because the combat application is that after there's a slash, after we slash through and we rechamber, there's a way to use the puño end to either impact or, with the horns, rake across. I think this is a very interesting feature because that raking across helps with the rechambering of the sword versus using it strictly as a puño, which is a little more direct line, which costs me time and movement to have to retract. What is of most interest to me is that there is some conjecture that this war face isn't necessarily the face of a human being. There is some conjecture that the face that you see on the pommel of the Minasbad sword happens to be the very mythical tikbalang of the Philippines. And the tikbalang is a half horse, half human being beast in the Philippines that has some very interesting superstition attached to it. One of them being that Filipino warriors, in order to test their mettle, were not necessarily so concerned with human opponents. According to local Filipino warriorship and culture, one of the ways to test your true warrior spirit was to face the tikbalang. You would go out into the woods, especially at midnight, under the heart of the banana tree. At midnight, this sap droplet would come out. You open your mouth, it drops into your mouth, and lo and behold, you will probably be fighting this half horse, half human being creature. In my opinion, the significance of the tikbalang as it relates to the Minasbad is that it is a reminder of the spiritual aspect of Filipino warriorship. Filipino warriorship, specifically in the United States, we don't necessarily discuss this. Filipino martial arts is far more relegated to a type of athletic activity. And in fact, here in the United States, there are more comparisons to MMA and FMA in terms of its effectiveness of use and even its relevance. What the Minasbad does, which is absent from the more modern design of the Itak Tagalog, is that since this is pre-colonial, it harkens back to a time when a lot of that local superstition still very much integrated itself seamlessly into warrior culture and warrior weaponry. As far as movement is concerned, and again, let's go ahead and compare it to the Itak Tagalog. It's very subtle when you hold them both. Aside from the fact that there is a greater termination of the belly swell as it goes towards the guard, so it is far more tip heavy, the other thing to consider is the fact that the termination of the handle along that it is narrower on this portion of it versus the Itak Tagalog, in that the Itak Tagalog has a sharper, ever so slightly sharper termination. What that does is that through ergonomic design, it dictates to the martial artist how to hold the weapon and ultimately how to apply the appropriate techniques. We see in a lot of World War II videos how Filipino guerrillas held their bolos in place, which are very similar to the Itak Tagalog. And it's mostly in this position. The hand and the sword occupy center line, the edge is forward, the checking hand is right in front. So from a visual standpoint, it actually forms this kind of X, which represents the jugular on each side of the opponent. But a lot of that has to do with the type of ergonomic design of the handle. Since it terminates a little bit more sharply, it allows it so that when it's in my hand, it allows it to align with the radius and ulna so that coming forward is far easier because it activates the tricep line. This isn't the case with the Minasbad. In fact, according to Lorenz Lasco, although there are some ergonomic features in antique Minasbad swords, he did make mention that a lot of the handles didn't necessarily have that narrowed feature that made it so that it was a dedicated centerline push-cut slasher. In fact, in some instances, he mentioned that some handles were in fact octagonal, meaning it was a little bit more circular. You don't necessarily see it to that extreme with this handle. However, you don't necessarily see the termination of the handle angle here the same way you do with the Itak Tagalog. It is slightly more rounded, which lends more to circular movement. So when you see this Minasbad sword held parallel to the ground, if I start to relax my hand, it tends to drop. It tends to be the natural position of the Minasbad once held parallel to the ground. It wants to fall. It is the same thing in this position. It wants to fall. This is not so with the Itak Tagalog. Part of it because it is a shorter sword. The other part of it is because the belly swell is not as extreme compared to the Minasbad, so that even if I relax my hand, it stays relatively parallel. even though I'm starting to loosen my fingers. So what this tells me is that the Itak Tagalog generally likes to move so that a lot of the attacks are going to be on the upper line of the torso, specifically along the lines of the jugular. When US Marines were deployed to the Philippines to fight Filipinos, Filipinos were armed with Itak Tagalogs and also barongs. The primary target of the Filipino guerrillas happened to be the jugular of the Marines. And as a countermeasure, US Marines were deployed with a type of leather scarf to wrap their neck to protect as a type of armor and protection against this type of attack, which is along the jugular. Hence the name Leatherneck for US Marines. The Minasbad, which was designed primarily for armored warfare, which had to deal with sword and shield warfare, does not as readily comply with this kind of positioning and with this kind of methodology. It allows it so that if it's held in this position, it likes to drop, so that if I need to come around and then half-hand it and then break the Kalasag shield, I can do it by grabbing this extra puño at the bottom. I have to be careful with how I grab it, because imagining that there are these two sharp ears pointing out, I'm not necessarily going to hold it completely around. This is a very interesting dynamic, because when I'm holding it this way, I'm firing the tricep line, but if I'm holding it this way, I'm actually activating the flexor reflex, which is more along the oblique sling on the contralateral side of the weapon hand. I bring this around and I fire here. My entire oblique sling from this shoulder to the contralateral hip fires in a very powerful manner, so that the Minasbad earned a reputation as the Kalasag breaker. I'm going to do a movement comparison with the Itak Tagalog, which is designed more for modern warfare conflicts that the Filipinos were engaged in, specifically closer to the 20th century, versus the armored warfare of pre-colonial battlefield capabilities of the Minasbad. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you for letting me share.
A study of the Minasbad is a study of the older Filipino systems. As with the majority of traditional Filipino blades, the Minasbad was designed specifically to address the sword and shield of the Cebuanos and the Moros in open warfare. You see how it likes to drop, and that kind of dropping makes it more tip-heavy, but also requires that the Bicolano warrior moved in a far more circular fashion so that the core would be engaged in controlling the sword. This is very different from the Itak Tagalog, which happens to be a little bit shorter and more easily controlled using arm-centric movements. This is why it is the favored weapon in more of the 20th century conflicts. From this perspective, we can see that even the subtlest design differences can lead to great implications as it relates to overall system development and strategy. From the deep inventory of Filipino sword design, two swords happen to take the marquee position in 20th century conflicts, and that happens to be the barong and the Itak Tagalog. From the perspective of ease of manufacturing but overall maneuverability, the arm-centric movements that the Itak Tagalog encourages ensures that the majority of its attacks happen to come from the higher lines, so that the targeting of the jugular is far more readily accessible. The majority of World War II guerrillas favored this Itak Tagalog also because their battlefield tactics required that one person be at point and usually looking to wound the person in front of them so that the rest of the group can finish them off as they consistently move forward. Subsequent generations of Filipino martial artists inherited and learned systems from grandmasters who participated in World War II as guerrillas. As a result, you can see some common principles being executed here. One of them is the high line attack along occupation of the center line. So with this type of tactic in place, you can see through the movement quality itself the sheer directness of movements and absolute no-nonsense approach as it relates to the implementation of modern 20th century Filipino martial arts. The movement biomechanics for the Itak Tagalog lends itself far more easily to modern FMA techniques like X patterning, replacement displacement stepping, closing the distance by using the checking hand. A lot of these elements are far more readily accessible with the use of the Itak Tagalog, simply because it is a far more arm-centric type of weapon, which is very different from the Minasbad. The Minasbad, being far more tip-heavy, really lends itself to an older type of Filipino martial art, a Filipino martial art that had to contend with the sheer size of the Kalasag shield. The Minasbad forces the Bicolano warrior to be far more circular, deceptive, and indirect when it comes to the positioning of the Minasbad sword, to get around the Kalasag shield but also to break it if need be. This is admittedly a very different set of biomechanical demands, but it is very clear why it is important for its efficient use, because since it is an open battlefield, it is also important for me, by using circular movements, to not just address the one opponent in front of me, but also the opponents that are around me. So when I am moving with this, I am working not only to get around the shield of my opponent in this imaginary battlefield, but also making sure that it is moving fast enough and with enough force, so that if there's anybody else around me, I can clear enough space so that I can move on to my next target. The following techniques in Tagalog could be called tusok sa lupa or hiwa sa lupa. Tusok means to stab and hiwa means to slash. So the tusok is to get around the shield and the hiwa is to break the shield. These initial techniques are designed so that we can go ahead and go through the shield and then ultimately close the distance to use the puño, which we had mentioned prior, which has the unique features of the tikbalang ears, which could be used to rake across the eyes of the opponent. But also notice how that unique grip with my left hand can start to use what we call in Tagalog pangamot, and pangamot means to scratch. So we are not only raking across the eyes with the puño, but also with our fingers. It is now from this position that I can lower myself so that I can either tusok towards the abdomen and then recover myself onto the next opponent. It's very easy to impose a more modern perspective and implement a more critical eye when we see these very circular biomechanics with the use of the Minasbad, but we have to remember what type of battlefield they were involved in. It is an open battlefield, open warfare, armored combatants with the use of sword and shield. So this type of circularity is absolutely required, and these bigger movements, although the person may seem very open, is necessary to get around with the big and formidable Kalasag shield while navigating the open battlefield. This is a very different timeline and a very different universe, requiring the warrior who moves with the Minasbad to move very differently, to think very differently, and to move more with the spirit rather than with just physicality. It is in this kind of universe where the Filipino gods of war ruled over the battlefield and ensured that the warrior was of the utmost importance in determining the fates of their people. It is these kinds of movements that are no longer readily available to us as far as Filipino martial arts is concerned, but we can still access them if we somehow respect the design of the Minasbad sword as it relates to their overall demands. It allows us to get in touch with the roots of Filipino martial arts, which happens to be that of a battlefield art that was all but worshipped by their Filipino warriors. It is very clear with a very simple observation of my movements with the Minasbad, adhering to it with the best of my abilities, that there is an older Filipino martial arts. How much of it is lost to us in time is something that we have yet to truly explore. But by really understanding the kind of battlefields that they had to go through, it is clear that the use of the Minasbad and all of its other sword brethren is a true time machine and time capsule in how they were able to encapsulate much of the Filipino martial arts prior to the arrival of the colonial Spaniards. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you for letting me share. Stick around, stay tuned, more videos to come.